Welcome everyone. Just watching the numbers climb. So hopefully we will reach critical mass soon. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started just with our webinar norms. So welcome everyone. Welcome to Storytelling for Social Change. This is a Voice of Witness webinar. We presented a very similar one in August. So welcome back if you attended that one. I hope it's not too much of a repeat, but we're hoping there's some new faces today as well. So before we kick everything off, just to go over some of the webinar norms. We are recording this webinar for future use, and all registered participants will receive a link to watch it. So if you know someone who registered but is unable to make it, don't worry, they're going to get a link to this recording later. Live closed captioning is available for this webinar. You can turn it on through the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There should be a little button that just says closed caption. If you are having any trouble finding that, please mention it in the chat and our host will help you out. If you'd also like to use the chat box for land acknowledgements, we like to visit the site nativeland.ca, where you can find out whose land you are currently residing on, and we are happy to hear where you're calling in from. And then finally, the Q&A function is for questions, and we have a dedicated Q&A section towards the end of this webinar, but you are welcome to put in your questions at any time, and we'll get to them at that time. All right, so I think we're all in now. So just to get us started, my name is Erin Vong, and I'm the Education Specialist and Program Coordinator at Voice of Witness. And Cliff, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Glad you're with us today. My name is Cliff Mayotte. I'm the Education Program Director for Voice of Witness.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ella Banerjee. I'm the Community Partnership Coordinator here at VOW.
And I am Sara Sinclair. I'm the editor of Voice of Witness's latest book, How We Go Home. My father is Korea Ojibwe. My mother is a German Jewish refugee to Canada. And I grew up in Toronto, but I currently reside in Brooklyn. That's Lenape traditional territories.
And Cliff, Ella, and I are all tuning in from Ohlone Land because we are all pretty much neighbors in what is now Oakland and Berkeley, California. All right, so just as a little interactive moment here, we'd love to hear from you in this quick poll. How familiar are you with oral history storytelling? We're just curious what your current level of familiarity is at. So in just a moment, a poll should pop up on your screen. If you can't find it, you can look at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar and there should be a button that says polling. And responses are rolling in now. So the options are, I've completed an oral history project, I'm working on an oral history project, I would like to start an oral history project, and I'm new to oral history storytelling. All right. And now you should also be able to see the poll results. It looks like a lot of you are new to oral history storytelling, so welcome. We are very happy to have you here today. And also a number of you have completed an oral history project before. We are also excited to have your expertise on here. I hope we can all learn something new from each other. Thank you, everyone. All right, now Cliff, do you want to explain who we are?
Yes. For those of you that are new to Voice of Witness, I'll share a little bit about our mission. Voice of Witness is an almost 11-year-old award-winning nonprofit based in San Francisco that advances human rights by amplifying the voices of people impacted by and fighting against injustice. And we do that through two main programs at Voice of Witness. One is our oral history book series, and the other is our education program. And Ella and Erin are going to share a few more details about each of those programs now.
The book series, as Cliff mentioned, is foundational to the work that we do. Right now, we have over 20 books in our series, which we're all really proud of. Our books are oral history books, and so they contain first-person narratives from people who have been directly impacted by injustice. We follow a birth to present day format, so the people who share their stories share an entire look at their lives. So you get a really three-dimensional picture of who they are as people and not just specific experiences they've had. We refer to the people who share their stories with us as our narrators. We don't use the term subjects or interviewees. They're our narrators, and they generously share their experiences with us through the book series. We have covered a number of topics through our almost 11 years as a nonprofit in the book series, but more and more we're focusing on two major areas. The first one is migration and displacement around the world, and that's highlighted by our recent book, Solito Solita, which came out in 2019. And the other topic that we're focusing on is the criminal justice system in the US. And some people might be familiar with 6 by 10, which came out in 2018. And we also, in addition to our book series, have a community partnership program where we connect to different organizations and nonprofits in the community who directly serve our narrator communities, which include but aren't limited to people who are refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, and people impacted by the justice system. And so we offer our storytelling and education resources as a way to help our community partners advance their advocacy work. And here's just one example from the artistic uprising that we participated in 2019 at the El Paso Juarez border. On the right, you'll see Gabriel, who is a narrator from Solito Solita, and he spoke at this demonstration at the border to talk about his experiences being a child refugee from Honduras.
Thanks, Ella. And here's just a little graphic that explains our education program theory of change, just to show how we build our oral history resources directly using the experiences and expertise of the narrators and the communities we support. So as an education program, we provide free curriculum for every single book that we publish, which is free to download on our website. We also offer general oral history resources that are available on our website. And we do a lot of work directly visiting classrooms, planning with teachers, consulting with other organizations to create oral history projects that feel authentic to your class or your community's mission, and to help you share stories in using our ethics-driven methodology, but presenting it in any way that feels authentic to you. So while we focus on publishing books, your final projects might look more like a podcast or a photo essay or a website, and we welcome any and all collaborations.
Okay, we always find it helpful when we're doing workshops and seminars and webinars to really create a working definition of oral history, and especially for folks who are new to oral history. We have two definitions here. One is the very formal academic definition provided by the Oral History Association, and one is kind of a voice of witness style interpretation, and how we as an organization connect with oral history and how that connects directly to our mission. So I just want to read a couple of these things. According to the Oral History Association of America, oral history is a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, community, and participants in past events. And kind of how we break that down a little bit is by saying oral history is an opportunity to, quote, humanize history. It goes beyond dates, facts, and figures, and can deepen our understanding of how history is written and how storytelling can illuminate issues and events in a profoundly personal way. And I think one of the things that we do at Voice of Witness is to connect oral history and social justice. And this quote from Arundhati Roy, I think, perfectly captures the intersection of storytelling, oral history, and social justice. And Arundhati Roy says, "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." And lastly, we just wanted to share a short quote from our book, Say It Forward, A Guide to Social Justice Storytelling. By its very nature, oral history can be thoroughly subversive because it makes space for stories that might otherwise not be heard. It creates a platform for individuals and communities that don't feel connected to more dominant established narratives to speak up and share their own personal experiences. So through those quotes and through those working definitions of oral history, that's how Voice of Witness, how we connect our mission to social justice through oral history and storytelling. And I wanted to bring it back and get Sara into the conversation and ask you, Sara, to say a little bit about, for this collection of Indigenous stories, for you, why oral history as a form, as an art form, and why specifically Voice of Witness?
Sure. I was really drawn to oral history because I wanted to use it to tell more contemporary Native American and First Nation stories in particular. So I came to New York City to take a master's program specifically in oral history, always with the hope that I would find a way to then use that education to amplify contemporary First Nations and Native American experiences. And Cliff, you were the first person that I met at Voice of Witness. As a student, I went to the Oral History Association annual conference. I think it was in Madison. And I had a friend who was in my cohort who had previously done some work with you guys. And she kind of gave me a nudge because at that point, my thesis work had started to move in the direction that I'd hoped. I did a series of interviews specifically with Native American people who'd grown up on reservation communities who left to attend those reservations, to attend elite academic institutions and then moved home again to work for their nations. And while I was doing that work at school, I very, very quickly started to envision a book as the long in the future kind of dreamed for outcome. Because the people that I was interviewing were such incredible narrators and I thought really amazing potential educators. They were able to narrate the circumstances of their own lives within a really, really long historical arc and also within a really broad social and economic and political context. So I was very quickly kind of energized and excited about the idea of a book. And I was excited about Voice of Witness in particular, because I love how accessible the books are. I love that they're not scary books. I love that they feel like they can be for a mainstream readership. They can be for a young audience. And so I, was nudged in the direction of Cliff and I sort of told him, this is what I'm working on. And his reaction was enthusiastic enough that it kind of began this whole relationship, which I guess is now, I don't know, 6 years long or something.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Sara. It has been that long. Yeah, 6 years, I think.
So,
Wow. Well, thank you. I wanted to see if we could take a moment and, we've been talking about oral history, for the last, 10 or 15 minutes. And I thought it'd be an idea to experience a little bit of oral history and to look at some of the different ways that oral history can be shared out and utilized. And so we have a couple of narrative excerpts that we're going to share for you today. And we've selected these excerpts to show the breadth of what an oral history project can look like. I mean, we talked about the books, Sara talked about how we go home as a book, but there's so many different delivery systems for oral history. And at Voice of Witness, we have several different approaches that we utilize in our oral history storytelling. And so we're going to get a sampling of several of those delivery systems for stories. The first excerpt you're going to hear is from a short form online story project called Unheard Voices of the Pandemic. And these are shorter pieces that have been published in various media outlets around the country, like salon.com and places like that. So it's not a long book. It's not, doesn't have multiple narratives, but it's a much more compact version of our oral history book series. You're also going to experience a short excerpt from one of our partnership and consultancy collaborations. And as Erin mentioned earlier, these are some of the projects and collaborations that we do with external organizations, other nonprofits, universities, all kinds of different organizations that want to utilize and harness our ethics-driven storytelling approach to further their work and to further their missions. And lastly, you'll hear a short excerpt from the Voice of Witness oral history book series. And I know we're going to have several readers for these short excerpts.
Yeah, so as Cliff mentioned, this first excerpt is from a recent project that we've been developing called Unheard Voices of the Pandemic. We started working on this project last April in response to the pandemic starting. And so for the first reason why we wanted to do this was just, in response to such a historic, unique event that we're all living through. But also, as the pandemic was starting, we were listening to a lot of rhetoric that was talking about how coronavirus and the pandemic was a great equalizer, and that it was treating everyone equally. But as probably everyone on this call knows, it's really affecting different communities in very different, inequitable ways. And so we created this shorter form oral history project where we didn't follow the, birth to present day format that we do for our full books, but instead our past editors reached out to past narrators to just ask them, to provide a snapshot of what their life has been like under the pandemic. So these are shorter excerpts that still allow someone to convey what their experience has been like. And while an in-person physical booklet might be coming near soon, keep your eyes peeled out for that. These excerpts have mainly lived online through a series of outlets that we partner with, including Salon and Prism and The Guardian. And so this excerpt that I'm going to be reading from is from a past narrator, Sherrod McFarland, who was a narrator in 6 by 10 Stories from Solitary. Sherrod is currently incarcerated in Michigan. And in this excerpt, which was published on Salon, he talks about the drastic changes that he's experienced while being incarcerated during the pandemic, and really the harsh conditions that he's had to experience. Living under such conditions is already a high stress situation, which probably negatively affects your immune system. But having to face the threat of a deadly pandemic ups the ante by 10. I'm not ashamed to say that the fear of death by coronavirus has crossed my mind many times. I'm in my 50s, I have asthma, and I've been in prison nearly 33 years straight, making me one of the more at risk. Some of the other men here are also quite vocal regarding their fears of the virus. But what can we do?
Thanks, Ella, for bringing Sherrod's voice into the room. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from our project called Hearsay, which was created in collaboration, partnership consultancy with the UCSF Memory and Aging Center, which is a center that focuses on the care, research, and diagnosis of people living with cognitive issues, particularly around dementia and Alzheimer's. So we selected this story as an example of how our work extends beyond what we may consider traditional storytelling vessels, but also extends into the world of medicine and research and caregiving. And we're just going to hear a short quote from Mark, who shared his story with our book as someone who lived with Alzheimer's and also worked quite a bit in advocating for people like him. Short of solving Alzheimer's disease, the best way to help is by teaching people we aren't vegetables yet, just spreading the word. Because for many people, they think, oh my God, it's the end of the world. And it's not the end of the world. It's not great, but it's not the end of the world. And that's important to let people know. That's why having our group is good, being able to teach people who are in the medical profession. And I think advocacy is great. People with the disease talking, telling our story. If research needs to be done, we can tell them why by showing our story.
Thanks, Erin. And I realized I should contextualize the book a little bit more. So after that conversation with Cliff at the Oral History Association conference, there was a period of probably close to a year where I worked with Voice of Witness to come up with to broaden the sort of central question that my thesis had investigated, to allow for more room to include a greater range of life experiences. So while my thesis work was really interested in education in particular, ultimately the book and our project together, How We Go Home, really looked at what is it like to be a citizen of a nation subsumed within a larger nation whose fundamental economic, political, cultural, and spiritual desires are so often at odds. So once we'd established that as our new central question, it really allowed for me to interview people with all kinds of different life experiences, and it allowed us to include many, many different issues that are affecting contemporary Indigenous life in North America today. Gladys was someone that we wanted to speak to, partly because of her own history surviving sexual violence, and also partly because after her own niece disappeared along what is known as Canada's Highway of Tears. It's a highway, a stretch of the Trans-Canada Highway that connects a logging district in northern BC to the ports. There are many, many reservations that are on this road, and there's a really, really high rate of Native women who are missing and murdered along that road. And her own, Gladys's own niece, Tamara Lynn Chipman, went missing in 2005. And Gladys, since then, has really dedicated her life to advocating for families across Canada, families of other missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So this is her quote. The mission statement that I wrote for Walk for Justice 2008 had the word genocide in it. And the general public agreed with that mission statement, including its use of the word genocide. When you think about it, our girls who are disappearing, age 14 to 25 is the average. Those are their childbearing years. So if we have 3,000 women who are missing or murdered, and we have an average of 5 children per First Nations woman, a national average, that's 15,000 children that we are missing for future generations. It's genocide.
Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. So we just wanted to take a quick moment to allow space for everyone to share a word in the chat that describes your feelings in response to hearing these stories. I know they were just very short excerpts, but we hope that you learned something, or something surprised or challenged you or affirmed something as you were hearing these 3 narrators share just a snippet of their stories with us. And I see the word powerful has come up quite a few times in the chat. That's wonderful. Grateful, deep, important, sadness, humanizing, meaningful, visible. I almost can't read fast enough to catch up. Human, profound, connection, eye-opening, devastating, resonance, hopeful, seen, solidarity, poignant, liberation, sadness, resistance. This is wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Please continue sharing if you feel you want to. We welcome your responses at any point during this webinar. And thank you for listening to these short stories from our narrators today.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Sarah, for adding that additional context around the process and Gladys's narrative. And I think we're going to get into that even more now in this section. We've been talking about Voice of Witnesses' empathy-based, ethics-driven approach to oral history and storytelling, and sort of using Sarah's process and How We Go Home and the creation of that oral history collection in the VOW series, kind of get at how this process has been interpreted and how it was utilized by Sarah in the creation of How We Go Home. So Sarah and the rest of the team will be chiming in about some of the details of this process, but we did just want to share a couple of key aspects, and several of them have been mentioned already, but we just wanted to capture some of the real guiding principles of our oral history process and how we approach our work, because for us, we feel that the process of documenting a story is as powerful as the story itself. And so that's something we really lean into in our work and want to share that with other folks. And so a couple of the guiding principles in our process include creating a chain of trust and finding narrators that are connected to that chain of trust, creating storytelling questions. As opposed to proving a thesis necessarily. Oral history is a great place to explore essential questions, as Sarah mentioned earlier in her comments. We're very committed to capturing the birth to now scope, preparing for the interviews and follow-up. You know, all of this work is ultimately about relationships, which I know Sarah and the rest of the team will talk about in a minute. And through the transcription and editing process, honoring your narrator. You know, the process of creating a compelling narrative that will be impactful for readers or listeners, but also honoring your narrator in that process and making sure that they're being represented the way they want to be represented. Collaboration and approval, collaborating with narrators, collaborating with community organizations, and ultimately the choices that you make around preserving, sharing, and archiving the stories, and who is the audience, and how do they maintain access to those stories. So these guiding principles and more will be explored by Sara and the rest of the VOW team as Sara goes into the process that she utilized for How We Go Home.
Thanks, Cliff. Yeah, so as I shared, this project had its origins as my master's thesis work. And there was one person in particular that was really key in establishing that circle of trust in those very early days. I had just moved to New York City. And so as one does when one moves to a new city, I was making new relationships, and those relationships were both, they were within my school community, within my neighborhood, but also within the Indigenous community in the city. And one of the first people that I met was a man named Rick Shaboya, who had strong ties to the Indigenous student population in New York City. Him and his wife both have had decades of experience working with Native students in higher ed, both recruiting them and then also helping schools to retain them. And so he very quickly just sort of opened, they really literally opened their apartment to Indigenous students in the city, hosting Fry Red Fridays at their home. And, I started to do that work. And he was somebody who really connected me with my very earliest narrators, two of whom are included in the book as it exists today, Ashley Hemmers and Wisipan Little Elk. And it was really a powerful example at the outset of my work as an oral historian that of this idea of the circle of trust, because he was so close to both Ashley and Wizi, because they had so much trust in him when he reached out to them and said, hey, I've met this new person, Sara, and she's doing this project. And yeah, she's good people and you can trust her. That meant the world. And so that meant that they both really opened up to me in a way that I have absolutely no illusions that they would have otherwise. That was all Rick. That was all the trust that they had in him being transferred to me. And those kinds of relationships then extended again, when I started to work with Voice of Witness and we really expanded the kinds of interviews, the kind of questions that we were going to be pursuing. The picture here is of my youngest sister, Minaway. When I started working with Voice of Witness, she was a student at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. And so she was able to connect me to people that she'd formed relationships with in British Columbia. And then also like putting that circle, the trust that I'd found with Rick forward, I was able to really lean pretty heavily on the transcript, or at that point, the edited interview that I conducted with Ashley Hemmers. That became a really common practice of mine. That particular interview was one of the first ones that I did. And it's still like one of my favorite interviews. And I had this very, very polished, edited draft that was probably at that point, maybe double the length that it is now. So maybe it was 20 pages. So when I reached out to people to approach them about participating in an interview, I was also able to say, and here's an example of what this kind of oral history process might result in one day. And I think that served two purposes. One, it I think showed that I had good intentions, that I was going to show a lot of care for their story, as hopefully they would see I had with Ashley's. It allowed them to see that, yes, although this was a project that was investigating human rights issues and difficult subjects, that it wasn't going to be anything resembling poverty porn, that there's a lot of integrity, that there's a lot of resistance in these stories as well. And then thirdly, it allowed them to see like this isn't a small ask. This is a really, really, really big ask. And we don't want to have we don't ever want to pretend that it's not, So I think that really was like a sort of full circle thing, that I was able to take that very first interview and then share it with people to help them to have more trust in the process and more trust in me to move forward. Ultimately, the storytelling questions and the birth to now scope, I think in an Indigenous context, my experience is that it's a little bit different. I've interviewed on other projects, and it's kind of common practice for oral historians to start an interview with, tell me a little bit about where and when you were born, and then sort of take it from there, like follow the clues that your narrator leaves for you. So, they'll share some of their earliest memories, and then it's really your job to be sort of their mirror and to pick up on the cues that they give you and to follow that path. within an Indigenous context, this wasn't true of every narrator, but most narrators started with the stories of their grandparents, stories of like history that began before their own lives, or histories that started with their connection to land. This particular photo was taken on an interviewing trip to the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation, where our narrator, Jacelyn Charger, lives. And the graffiti translated to English says, "Honor Mother Earth." And this was sort of within the, this was a few years ago. So this was like right after her tribe's success in battling KXL. And it was like very shortly after the whole movement that formed around Standing Rock. So I think one thing to consider when you're starting to work with new set of narrators or any new individual is, where does that person's story begin? It might not begin with their own birth. In this particular project, it really didn't. Many narrators started with a prayer to their ancestors. They wanted to bring their ancestors into this space. Many narrators started with their traditional introduction, so introducing themselves in their own language, naming their tribe and their clans. In a non-Indigenous context, I've heard some friends, my friend Liza Zapol, who interviews a lot of artists, she now makes it common practice to start with, tell me who else is in the room with us today. Because that allows people to kind of bring in other influences, and it sort of allows for maybe a less linear beginning. Another oral historian colleague, Nissa Chow, instead of starting with the where and when were you born, she starts with something even broader, which is, tell me what it is that I need to know to understand the person who's sitting in front of me right now. But the idea is to kind of create like a starting place that works for your narrator, and then yes, to follow those clues from wherever that beginning is for them, through whatever issues you want to cover, to the present. This photo is, we were taking a ferry somewhere around Vancouver Island. This is my sister Minaway, who accompanied me on that whole portion of the research trip, because that's my little son Julian, who was 2 at the time. And so my sister Minaway was like our driver and babysitter and like friend and person to decompress with after all the interviews. So within the context of these interviews, preparing was really learning as much as I could about the particular nations that I was visiting. So here it was learning about the Tsartlit First Nation, the Snemo First Nation that we were visiting on the island. And that was both like by actually being there and walking around and seeing what it felt like, and also by doing as much research as I could before we went. So learning about the history of particular nations, and also doing as much learning as I could about the particular issues that we wanted to illuminate within the context of these interviews. This is a photo from our launch in October, and you'll see pictured, there's Gladys Raddick on the bottom left, Ashley Hemmers on the top right, and then Suzanne Mathot, who we ultimately hired to put together the education curriculum for the book. But in between all those research trips and this particular moment was actually probably where the bulk of the work took place. And that was really when things, now I'm working with this whole Voice of Witness team. And I feel like, I've gotten the opportunity to work with so many different members of the team. For like 2 years, it was just me and Dao Tran, the managing editor of the book series, who, were just sort of back and forth with follow-ups. I would send her a draft after I'd put together a first draft, and she would take a look at it and, okay, this is working, there are some gaps in the narrative here, I'm confused about this, can you go back to the narrator? So between those first trips taken to meet with all the narrators, there were probably 4 or 5 drafts in between then and publication, and mostly people were really willing to hop on the phone. There was one narrator who was based in New York, Robert Ornelas. So that was nice because it meant that we could actually visit more. But otherwise, it was mostly over the phone. And it was a long process, and I think one of the cool things about it is that by the time it was done, like I would say that I do kind of feel like most of the narrators became my friends, mostly just because, we spent so much time together over a period of years. So ultimately that value that oral history holds, that, you know, this is a co-creation, that these documents are co-authored, you know, the other outcome is that you really do form real and true relationships with people, because you've invested so much time in the process of creating something that hopefully everybody's really, really happy with. I think one piece of advice that I received really early on from my thesis advisor, Audra Simpson, was, you know, when you're sending these drafts back, because every step of the way I would send it back to the narrators to make sure that they were okay with it. She's like, just ask if you got it right. Did you get it right? You know, keep it simple. And I think that was such good advice, because that question never felt too hard to ask, even though, you know, sharing it with the narrators was always really scary, you know, because they're so generous in the time that they spent with me sitting down and sharing their stories. And then, you know, editing is a powerful kind of act, right? And I always wanted to make sure that I was really honoring the version of the story that they hoped to tell themselves. So yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a beautiful peek into the whole years-long process that went into How We Go Home. And I think it just shows the dedication our editors like you put into honoring our narrators so beautifully and authentically in this process. So with that great overview of the process, Ella and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the essential questions that come up for us, not just in the book projects, but in any oral history project that we take on, whether it's with a classroom or a community or another organizational partner. And so we're just going to talk a little briefly about what all of this means to us and why we ask ourselves these questions. So the first, how do we create a safe and brave space, and how do we maintain it? So if you've ever been in a more formal Voice of Witness workshop, you will hear the term safe and brave space quite a bit, because we think really deeply about what our narrators need and what we need as interviewers to create a space where people feel not just safe, but brave enough to share their story, knowing it is going to leave the room we're in. And it is going to enter a world where we can't always make it safe, but we can hopefully provide enough support to help you feel brave enough to put it out there and know that you will always have a team behind you that supports your story and your experience. And the next, Ella, do you want to?
Yeah. So the next question is, how do we address ownership of these narratives? And so I think it's really important for us to always recognize that these stories belong to our narrators. Our role is, you know, our job is to help create a platform, is to help amplify, but the stories fully belong to the narrators. And so, as Sarah mentioned, as she was talking about her process, she shared a version of the drafts of the narratives with the narrators every step of the way. And so you want to make it, you know, really clear that the narrators are able to look at those drafts, that they're able to get final say over the final version of the narratives that gets published, that they also know, you know, where these narratives are going to end up. When we're starting an oral history project, there's so many different ways that the final product could be shared, whether it's in a book or online or an audio. And so really making it clear to narrators that, you know, what the process will be, and that they have, you know, the power to say no at any point in the process if they don't want their story to be shared, that they know that this story is theirs and we really respect that it belongs to them.
And the next question is, how can we use a trauma-informed approach to interviewing? And this is a big topic for us because so many narrators have experienced really challenging and traumatic things in their life. And we want to make sure, as we tell their birth to now story, we're giving them enough space to be their whole self and not just the worst, most dramatic part of their life, which in another form of media might capitalize on. But for us, we want to make sure we've given them space to process who they are alongside what has happened to them and what that really means for them as a whole human being. And so as we approach what we have said many times before, the birth to now, it's giving someone an opportunity to portray themselves beyond that worst experience, beyond the most traumatic. We don't shy away from sharing this information. But this is also where, as Sarah mentioned, the back and forth and collaboration with the narrator comes into play, because you want to make sure your narrator feels comfortable sharing this information. they may have gone through something that they don't want to share, even if it is a big part of their lives. And that's okay. The point of our oral history approach is that we are sharing something together. And as Ella had mentioned, this is part of the ownership of the story, reminding our narrators it's their story, it always has been, and it always will be. And we want to make sure they are comfortable with whatever they put out into the world, and we are excited to share what we can.
And the last question we have here is, what is our position in these stories? And we think it's really important to acknowledge that, as an interviewer, you're still sharing that space with your narrator. And so things about, your own self and your own identity do influence that space. We really want to acknowledge that. So it's important to think about, power dynamics, your position as you're sitting down to do an interview with somebody, or if you're asking someone to be part of a storytelling project. Ask yourself, what are those power dynamics at play? And also thinking about what are the insider outsider dynamics. This can be a good thing. Sometimes if you are an outsider coming to a project, that means that you can ask questions and ask for clarification, ask for context about things. But also, as Sarah mentioned, making sure that you're not putting the burden of your narrator to explain everything about a history or a culture. And so you're doing your own homework, you're learning as you're part of that process. And so really thinking about those dynamics carefully and taking the time to build relationships, and making sure that's just part of your process as you're approaching a project.
Great. So with all of that, we wanted to make sure we made space for questions. And I know a couple of them have come in through the chat and Q&A panel, but this is where if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. You should see a button on your toolbar to type in your question, or you can just type it directly into the chat, and we're keeping an eye on that too. So I will read a couple questions, and whoever wants to take it on can answer. So one question's come in: with regard to using a trauma-informed approach, how do VOW editors compensate narrators for the emotional labor they undergo during their storytelling? And this ties into another question that came in through the chat, which is, does Voice of Witness pay narrators for their time spent sharing and reviewing these stories? And just very quickly, I will say we do not pay our narrators for the exchange of their stories. And for us, it's because we don't want people to feel like they have to give us a $100 story or a $20 story or whatever monetary amount we've put on it. We do, however, offer support in other ways, whether that's connecting them with organizations that can help them with any legal issues they may have or any other type of support they need. And we do compensate for any time they've spent at our events, for advertising the book, for follow-up. And of course, they get copies of their book as much as they want to share with their communities. So for us, the interview itself is not monetarily compensated, but the relationship that builds afterward and the work they do beyond that is.
And that could, just to add to what you're saying, Erin, that could include paying for childcare. If somebody, has childcare needs as they're sitting down to do an interview so they can have the time to talk to us, or paying for, a meal when they sit down for us, or transportation. So, as Erin's saying, the interview itself, we're not compensating for, but as much as possible, making it easier for them to participate and respecting their time and their energy.
Great. Another question that's come in: how do you decide what to keep in with regards to the traumatic narrative? Does the narrator get the final say, or do you make your own censoring decisions? So I think, Sarah, you might want to jump in on that.
Sure. I think it's really helpful because at the outset of the interview, I'm always really clear that I don't treat this as a get, this conversation, like we're having this conversation now, but you have every opportunity between now and publication, and then like for future prints even, to make changes. So I think there's a lot of freedom that gives people in sharing the story they want to share it, allowing themselves to like make meaning of the story as they're sharing it in that moment, knowing that they will then see it in print, they can revisit in audio, and then they can make those decisions about what they want to take out. Normally, I will put together a first draft and then share that. And then from that draft, people can say, you know what, actually, and this happened with one narrator in particular. it's often the case that what is shared, people that I choose to interview, I don't want to interview someone who's not ready to tell their story. And there are all kinds of, not that I'm an expert, but I think that there are all kinds of clues that that someone can give us that actually they're not well enough to tell their story yet. So I would say that the people that I interviewed for How We Go Home, I didn't feel like I was at risk of re-triggering them. But in some instances, after they shared their story, they felt, I think, more conscious of the way that their story might impact other loved ones. It wasn't so much that they were concerned about the image that they were projecting of themselves. It was, oh, you know what, actually, I don't want my story to hurt, somebody else's feelings. I don't want my story to hurt this other relationship in my family. And so in those instances, they would just simply ask to take out a part, and then I would, and then we would move forward.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Ella, I think this might be a good question for you. What are some actionable strategies we can integrate into our daily lives and work to ensure we are respectfully collaborating with others?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think just overall, if you're collaborating with people, just sort of checking your own assumptions at the door. And so knowing that just because, you think something will be helpful for an organization, it might not actually be the case. Maybe it has good intentions, but the impact isn't actually going to be the most useful, the most beneficial, the most meaningful. So I think it's really important to make space to listen, and to, when you're partnering with somebody, really ask them, what do they need right now? What do they need later on? What will be most helpful? So really, checking your assumptions and making that space to listen fully to your partner. And I think also recognizing that partnerships and collaborations take a lot of time. Just because you want to work with somebody and you're both interested in collaborating on something, sometimes for a variety of reasons, from capacity to other needs, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to create a collaboration right then and there. Really creating a collaboration, creating a relationship takes a lot of time. So being patient, realizing that if you want to invest in each other, it will take some time, and just respecting that.
What you're saying, Ella, reminds me of the phrase that I've been hearing a lot lately. It's I think it's a title of a book, but it's the phrase is "moving at the speed of trust,"
Yeah.
which is something I think is very applicable to what you're saying.
Cliff, this might be a good one for you. What's the best way to practice asking open-ended and storytelling questions so that the interview doesn't sound too rehearsed?
I think there's a couple of things there, and I appreciate that question. I think we talked a lot about preparing for interviews, and Sarah talked about her preparation process. And sometimes as we prepare, it's definitely connected to honoring our narrators and honoring their time and their commitment. But I like to talk about preparing for interviews and interview questions. It's like prepare, and be totally comfortable improvising in the moment. As things come up, as you're being present with a narrator, and follow-up questions are a great way to keep that, keep the dialogue and keep the interview fresh and flowing, because these are questions that you're asking in the moment, on the spot. That we talk about wanting to create inspiring interviewing questions for our narrators. And part of that inspiration process is demonstrating that you're actively listening to them by repeating back something they had said earlier and that you're curious and want to hear a lot more about. And so that can really keep things fresh. And thinking about, I'm using the term, inspire, very explicitly, creating questions that will inspire a story as opposed to a response. And one of the examples that we use occasionally in our other trainings and workshops is not necessarily the question, where were you born? But, can you describe where you grew up? And that just sends somebody into a whole sort of set of detailed stories in a lot of different directions. And I think the only other thing I would mention is that those open-ended questions, those inspiring storytelling questions, offer a lot of freedom and space for a narrator to interpret that question and move it in a direction that they want, that's on their mind, as opposed to feeling like, oh, what if I answer this question wrong? An open-ended question, there's no such thing as a wrong answer. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind based on that question.
Thanks, Cliff. There have been a few questions in here from educators asking how to bring this work into the classroom. And I won't go into all of it here, but I will say, if you visit our website on our education page, we have a million resources for how to start your own oral history projects with students, all the way from, starting an idea, figuring out how you want to deliver it, to sample release forms that you can use and edit for your students, as well as another person had asked about creating that safe and brave space. We have a whole lesson about talking about that question and what students need to feel safe and brave enough to share and interview. So our lovely host has put the link to our education page in the chat if you want to check that out. Everything on that page is free to download. We also have resources for English language learners as well who are experiencing these projects. As we know, English language learners now make a very large population of our students, and we are happy to say they are just as involved in this oral history process. And sorry, there's lots of questions coming in. So this might be a good question for any of you on the panel. How do you think that Voice of Witnesses approach differs from how journalists approach their interviews, especially those who intend to bring to light issues of vulnerable communities by capturing authentic and transparent stories?
Yeah, well, I think just to jump in, I think the first like obvious difference is that we have this first person narrative approach, right? And so with the traditional journalist piece, it's written from the third person, and so really these oral histories are from the first person. You're seeing it through the eyes of a narrator, and they're telling their own story in their own words. So it's really centered on that person as a human and their perspective. So I think that's kind of the major difference, and you really get to understand how a person is feeling in the moment, their emotions, their thoughts. I think it's much more personal than, a traditional piece of journalism, but there definitely is overlap. And several of our editors have a background in journalism and have been reporting in a more traditional journalistic way on, the different communities and the topics of the books before they do a Voice of Witness book.
I could add to that just with a specific example. One of the narrators in How We Go Home, Jacelyn Charger, who I traveled to Cheyenne River Indian Reservation to interview, she became sort of a highlighted activist at the movement at Standing Rock. She was one of the first 5 people to set up camp there. And there had been a profile of her done in the New York Times that she was really displeased with because basically, I guess in the hurry that the journalist felt that they were under to put together this piece, they came to Standing Rock, or they then traveled to Cheyenne River and sort of interviewed around her to put together this portrait of Jacelyn and her family and her life. They did speak with Jacelyn, but they relied more heavily on the contributions of other people to kind of fill out this portrait. And Jacelyn was in particular really displeased with the way that they described her mother. And so when I traveled to meet with her, we ended up meeting at the Dairy Queen, actually, on the reservation, because it was the only place that was open when I went there. And she had done me a favor by traveling closer to where the airport was. Anyway, so she came in with her partner, and he really hovered quite close for some time. And then over the course of the conversation, I think once he felt like I was trustworthy, he kind of retreated to another area. And then Jacelyn told me, I had this experience. I really didn't like it. I didn't like the way that my family was portrayed. And so I think oral history just gave her an opportunity to retell her own story and to create a portrait of her own life and her family the way that she wanted to, because the ethics of oral history really dictate that we give our narrators shared authority. So just the process, the standard practice of going back to the narrator and saying, did I get it right, means that, had I not, she could have said, no, actually you didn't, and I want you to change it this way. And so we wouldn't have found ourselves in that situation that she had found herself in with the Times.
So with that, unfortunately, we are on a time limit. We will try to get to as many questions as we can still in the Q&A function, so we'll be typing our responses as we can. In the meantime, if you would be willing, we'd love to hear an aha moment from you from this webinar so that we can learn from each other's learning. So this might be a quote, a reflection, a connection, something somebody said, something you read in the chat that just relates to your experience with storytelling and something you'd like to take away from this webinar. We would love to hear from you. And as folks are putting in their aha moments, which we would love to read, we did want to just mention all the different ways that we would love for you to please stay in touch with us.
Yes, and a couple of those ways are attending our upcoming workshop series later in the spring. We're going to be doing a 3-part series that kind of dives deeper into several aspects of the oral history process. So please be on the lookout for that.
And of course, as mentioned, sorry, Cliff.
Go ahead, Erin.
We have a ton of free oral history resources on our website. Also, a lower bullet point for teachers who are in this webinar, please feel free to reach out directly to the edu@voiceofwitness.org email address, and I will personally respond back to you, but we'd love to know how we can support you in your journey on bringing oral histories into the classroom.
Mm-hmm. You can also connect with us around exploring our consulting and services. And as we saw in an earlier example with the UCSF Memory and Aging Center, we have consulted with a variety of organizations around the country and around the world, and would love to talk to you about how you think some of our process can fit into the work that your organization might be doing, whether you're doing an oral history project or incorporating different aspects of storytelling in your work. So we'd love to talk more about that. And a pretty straightforward one. Read Voice of Witness books and spread the word about Voice of Witness far and wide to all of your communities. And as Erin said, reaching out with any questions, edu@voiceofwitness.org.
And of course, our social media. We are all over all the major programs. I understand if you are, as many are, taking a break from social media, but if you are as obsessed with Instagram as many of us are, we're on it. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and it's a great way to just stay in touch with everything that's happening in our world. And we also love to share things that our partner organizations and collaborators are doing as well. So it's just a great resource if you're interested in learning more about the oral history community. All right, now with that, I can see a lot of aha moments coming to the chat, and they're amazing, and we're so excited to be reading them. We are running short on our hour limit, so we will be trying to answer some last minute questions as we leave, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It has been a pleasure to have all 138 of you watching, and we are so grateful to have you now officially in our Voice of Witness community.